Okay, quite a lot of people already joined in, so I think we can start with our program for today, tonight, in some regions in the morning. So I welcome all of you to our online symposium, Decolonizing Education. My name is Christian Hiller, and I'm a co-curator of the Contested Modernities project. I welcome you on behalf of the curatorial team, which is formed by Sally Belo, Moritz Henning, Eduard Kögel, and me. Before I give a brief introduction to the content of the entire project and today's event, I would like to inform you about some technical setup details. So this event takes place via Zoom, as you already know, because you joined in. It's also streamed on Facebook and will be recorded. So if anyone does not want to be recorded, he should mute and don't take part in the discussion. So please, for now, everyone is asked to mute your microphones, that we give space and the word to the speakers. And if you have any questions or comments, you can post them in the chat. Our colleagues will collect them, and then we will try to include the comments and questions in the final discussion. So during the questions and answers, Q&A at the end, you can also use your raise hand button to contribute to the conversation. The technical conduction of the event will be held by Erwin Wilms, who will be also able to support you in case of technical problems or questions. So I'm now coming to our theme. Today's event, entitled Decolonizing Education, marks a conclusion of two projects: Encounters with Southeast Asian Modernism and Contested Modernities. The projects include exhibitions and events taking place since 2019 in the countries of Cambodia, Indonesia, Myanmar, Singapore, and Germany. In addition, a comprehensive website, a seminal Art Plus publication, and the series of online symposia were realized. This project was driven by two key perspectives of interest. First, a historical perspective. How did the process of post-independence decolonialization occur historically in different countries in Southeast Asia? And what role, especially, did architecture and urban planning play in this process? And second, a more contemporary perspective. How are architects, artists, curators, activists, and professors, other scholars, driving the engagement with architectural modernism today? How do they collect, generate, and circulate new knowledge about it? Encounters was initially developed and funded in the context of the Bauhaus centenary. We were less concerned with the direct connections between the Bauhaus and Southeast Asia, but the Bauhaus as an innovative educational institution was often an important reference in our conversations. Many ideas from the Bauhaus seem outdated nowadays, but on the other hand, their concepts and formats of teaching are still a relevant source of inspiration until today. So the themes of education, knowledge, and learning ran through our project on many levels. A fundamental question was and is, how can we develop more knowledge about Southeast Asian architecture modernism, and how to debate it internationally? What concepts, methodologies, platforms, networks, and formats exist or are in the making? Over the course of the project, we have become familiar with many institutions and initiatives that are developing spaces, situations, and environments of learning. For example, Zaza Art Projects in Phnom Penh, the Good School in Jakarta, the NTU Center for Contemporary Art in Singapore, or here in Berlin, the Haus der Statistik, where the exhibition took place, the final exhibition. So what unites them is that they develop educational formats that work transdisciplinary, are open to non-academic knowledge, include local expertise into the discourse, and question official narratives. So they enable students, researchers, artists, and activists to pursue new approaches to research and to reinterpret narratives about architectural modernism that were formerly shaped by colonialist powers or national political parties. No, they discuss and relate them in terms of their global and local political and social dimensions. That's why the idea came up to us to dedicate this last symposium to the theme of decolonizing education and to discuss approaches from the past, the present, and the future. So we are very pleased that today, for this, three of our central partners that accompanied us in the project from the beginning and also supported us with their splendid knowledge are again involved today. Ho Puai Peng, Lino Wood, and Utemeta Bauer. We are also glad that we have been able to win 3 new positions for today's symposium, which will expand the topic with new knowledge horizons and questions. Pauline van Rosmalen, Eko Bravoto, and Martino Stierli. All participants will be introduced in more detail by Ho Puai Peng and me later on. But to come to an end of my introduction, I would like to briefly present Ho Puai Peng, who will be the moderator of today's event and will kick off the symposium with an initial speech. So from his very impressive biography, I will now only pick up some of his latest activities. Ho Puai Peng holds the UNESCO Chair on Architectural Heritage, Conservation and Management in Asia. He's currently Professor of Architecture and Head of the Department of Architecture at the School of Design and Environment at the National University of Singapore. Further, Puai Peng is a conservation consultant, architect, and advisor to many conservation projects in Hong Kong and Singapore. Currently, he's a member of the Senior Advisory Board of the Global Heritage Fund and a patron of the International Duhang Project of the British Library. So many projects that are directly related to our questions here. And we are very happy to have you as an expert on the question of learning and how to rethink learning on architectural modernism. And you were already involved in our project from the beginning and curated the exhibition Housing Modernities at in Singapore. And it was finally also shown in Berlin. So I give you a very warm welcome, and you now will talk about the architecture education for Asia.
Thank you so much, Christian, for this wonderful introduction. And really, it's our really great pleasure, and really we learn a lot from this particular projects or 2 projects for more than 2 years almost. And so I think this is a very important conclusion to our projects when we look at the new independent states and the architectural educations thereof. So what I would do is to really look at 3 examples and 3 sites, but primarily on Singapore in terms of architecture education. And I would really want to tease out the values that we hold as a school, as an educator of architects in Southeast Asia and in East Asia. So I'll start with National Central University in Nanjing, which was set up, the School of Architecture, in 1927. The reason why I selected Nanjing was primarily because this is one of the earliest school. I mean, there was one earlier, slightly earlier, but this was set up in the nationalist government when they settled down in Nanjing after overthrowing the imperial government, as well as surviving the Civil War. And the other reason that I selected this was because this was one of the earliest school, apart from those in Japan, as a kind of a prototype of architecture education for a uprising new modern nation in Asia, or at least in East Asia. And the third reason was because my father went to this school to study architecture. And so this is the older buildings that my father took in 1944, just after the Japanese War. And the building shows that it's a very classical architecture. Now, primarily because some of the early teachers were all trained in the States. And a lot of these teachers were trained in UPenn, at Yale, at MIT, Michigan, and Illinois. This one here on the top was the first head of department trained in Illinois. And Yang Tingbao is a student at Penn, and a very brilliant student, said to be really a very, very successful, or would be a successful architect. And so they were all educated in the West, and especially in America, and returning to Asia. The other school that I was thinking of is the School of Architecture at the University of Santo Tomas in Manila. And they were set up like 3 years later in 1930. And throughout the iterations of the school, many, many great modern architects of the Philippines were trained from this particular school. And even the original buildings of the College of Architecture and Engineering in 1950s was almost like a very pure modernist edifice. Then the Department of Architecture was first set up, excuse me, was first set up in the Singapore Polytechnics here in Singapore in 1959. And that coincided with the opening of this new campus, again, a very modern building, opened in 1959. And one of the earliest teacher was Lim Chong Kiet, who was teaching at this university, excuse me, full-time for a few years. And he was really very much reminded of someone coming back from, say, MIT. He was originally from Penang, went to MIT and returned to Singapore for teaching at the Department of Architecture. And the five surviving, or not surviving, but the five full-time graduates of the department from this Singapore Polytechnics all remember Chong Kiet very well, but also his methodology. So the first head of department was a Brit, David Vickery. I think he was the head of department maybe for a year or slightly more than a year. And he resigned from a post because when Dr. Toh Chin Chye, Deputy Prime Minister at the time in 1959, took over the chairmanship of the Board of Governors, he talked about the education in Singapore that should be on its own feet rather than looking towards other people for validation. And he's referring, especially in architecture, to the Royal Institute of British Architects. And so he said, and I quote, "We will welcome recognition from anywhere, but we will not be subjected to vetting." End of quote. So this is about RIBA recognition. But in the end, RIBA did recognize the school from 1968 onwards, and that's every 5 years they will send someone to come for a visitation. David Vickery resigned from the post primarily because he wasn't very happy with Dr. Toh Chin Chye's words that this school should not be subjected to RIBA's vetting. They can come, they can recognize, but not vetting. And so this is the first step, I think, in terms of decolonization. However, when I look at the history of education, architecture education in East Asia and Southeast Asia, I see the pattern of the values that we embodied in our education. And some of these critical values that we see are really very pervasive in East Asia and in Southeast Asia, but not necessarily the only values that you see around, or not necessarily aligned with values in the West. This is Yang Tingbao's, as I said, a very famous architect at the time, but a teacher, design of a almost like modernist hospital in Nanjing in 1931. these are some of my father's sketches from the design studio at that time in 1944. And you can see that the design had definitely the modernist tone. So these are, I think, his second year work at that time at the school. And in the Philippines, Locsin, obviously everybody knows him, has been designing buildings, a graduate from St. Thomas, designing buildings as modern, but at the same time with the sensibility of the curves, the lines, and so on, that may recall the sensualness of the Filipinos' culture. And Chongket himself designing the very modern style, the conference hall, for example, here in 1965, which is just across the road or across a grass patch from the Singapore Polytechnic, and in the modern style. And the modernity for them, as we discussed in our previous symposium, is about independence. It's about identity. It's about looking forward. It's about joining hand with the modern world that this post-independence nation or the independent nations would be looking forward to. And one of the one of the five graduates taking soon, as well as one of the part-time graduates, Gan On, designed this Golden Mile complex, which I'm very happy to say that the government is preserving this. So this will be conserved as a conserved building. But this one is not so lucky. Tang Ching-Xiong and other graduates, which is part-time graduates, also designed this Burbank apartment. The image on the right shows that it's being dismantled and demolished, unfortunately. So apart from the value of this modern world serving as a new identity, the value of the past is also an important aspect in most of our the three universities, or especially the two universities that we survey. So to me, this is diversity in identity. When I was teaching in Hong Kong, I bring students to villages in China, looking at the traditions. Here in NUS, we bring students to Yogyakarta and looking at the traditions and looking at the sensibility of our part of the world, our culture, our built heritage, even in India as well. And during the time of my father, these are his notes from 1944 on city planning. They look at both the West, like the Garden City, Letchworth, and so on. But he also had classes in Chinese architecture history, and you see the drawings over here. And so the Western history, the Western ideas, the Western typology, as well as the Southeast Asian or the Asian history and culture and architectural types are all studied. The first field trip to Malacca and Penang, led by Chong Kiet of the Singapore Polytechnic students, when visiting Malay houses in the village, talk to the craftsmen, understand how they work. And even in the modernist conference hall, Chong Kiet himself worked with traditional Mengkwang inspired tile pattern in his decorative wall in the lobby, in the courtyard of the conference hall. And here, just 2 days ago, when we had our first year studio review, our students are looking both at the Parthenon as well as the Angkor Wat, and they study them equally hard, looking at everything about the West as well as the East. And so the past served for us the identity, and that identity is indeed universal, but also that identity is also diverse and located in our location. The other value is the crafts. The crafts, and that is about design excellence. And when I look at the Manila, a building as early as 1931 is the Metropolitan Theater, designed by Juan Arellano. And it's a very beautiful Art Deco building. So learning from the West, the Art Deco form, but included also the very specific Filipino sensibility. whereas Chongket's design for the Jurong Town Hall in 1975, it's really an edifice of modernity, but also an assurance of the independent nation, looking at changing the landscape of Singapore from an entrepot, a trading hub, to a very powerful industrial powerhouse, so that this is how we might survive. This is how we join the world, but this is also the identity of the modern, but as well as really great design in terms of design excellence. Then around us, we talk to each other, and because our shared conditions, whether it is within the countries of Southeast Asia or with East Asia and or with South Asia, because we are linked so much to the whole of Asia as a trading hub. We share the very high density in our cities. We shared all this chaos, but also we share this modern high density living, or the hawker center in Singapore, where we share food together in this kind of relationship. And so this is how we address the high densities of our cities around. And this is how we also address the future of high density living, but at the same time looking after our sustainability in food. Then the locality is really very important. And I think in here, decolonization is not just an ideology. Decolonization is talking about our shared values. And this shared values is also about our survival, how we relate to the climate, how we face the climate emergency, how can we sustain ourselves both in food, water, air, energy, and how we can be resilient versus the seawater rise danger that we are all facing. 2 days ago, again, I just received this book, which is a project between University of Sydney and NUS, and one of my colleagues, Eric Leroux, was part of this editor, and some of my colleagues as well were the authors of some of these articles. And really, it is an important lesson to understand what we do not see in the climatic elements, the dry, the wet, the cool, and the hot, and how we can really address these issues in our design, in our work, but also in the design studio. So this is a colleague of mine, Lilian Chi, weathering the monsoon, what kind of relationship that we have with this annual monsoon seasons. And this is written by Eric, explorations of climatic design in design studios, how we address, how we allow our students to address issues of the climate and the climate crisis. Now here we are not talking about just universal issues, but we are also talking very much about our local issue, because I think local and universal or universality would all come together. And so there's no colonization or decolonization discourse here, but just a sense of survival. And obviously we all know the work of Woha, one of our graduates, Mansang, designing many very important landmarks in terms of sustainability, greenness, as well as social sustainability. The Ang Mo Kio Bishan Park that has a beautiful sort of landscape, but it's a plain that allows for water to rise and to flood the plain, but really enjoyed by many people living in these two new towns. And our students work in thesis work like 2 years ago, New Frontier of Change, looking at the climate change, but also looking at the seawater rising and how we deal with that. Looking at forest, how can we spatially experience the forest? And our building itself undergoing now many new renovation and changes. We strive to do a carbon zero building, and we strive to do a zero energy building. And so hopefully in all our work, both in our own project, in our studio, in our education, we hold on to the values of this all that I've encompassed. So the universal value, the value of the past, the very core value of the craft, the value of the climate, and the value of interconnectedness. Thank you. I'll stop share here. Yeah, sorry. Okay. Now I would like to introduce our next speaker, and we'll leave the Q&A to the very end, so that we will be having a good discussion among the speakers. And if you have any question in the meantime, please put your question in the Q&A so that we can answer those questions towards the end, half an hour of our symposium. Now, our next speaker is an acquaintance for a long time, Pauline van Hoosmalen. And Pauline is a Dutch architecture historian specializing in Dutch colonial and post-colonial architecture in Indonesia. Her PhD was about urban planning in the Dutch East Indies, and it comprehensively describes how town planning in the late colonial and early post-colonial period developed from a haphazard to a methodological as well as autonomous discipline, and what plans were designed and implemented. So Pauline regularly speaks and publishes on various topics related to post-colonial built heritage in Indonesia, its history, its threats, challenges, and many opportunities. And she also initiated in a very important archives from 2011 to 2014, the development of a digital repository for sources on European colonial architecture and urban planning at TU Delft. And Pauline will be speaking on on Mind the Gap, colonial architectural history in Dutch academia and beyond. Pauline, please.
Thank you all for your, first of all, for the introduction, secondly, for the invitation, or maybe the other way around. I'll share my presentation with you. Oh dear, what's happening here? Can you now see my presentation, because it's disappeared from my screen?
No, I can see it, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we can see it now. Yeah, you can do it full, yeah. That's
yes.
Right.
Let me check if this works. Yes, because this didn't work yesterday. Thank you very much. Again, I am going to, as an architecture historian, I thought maybe it would be interesting to talk about colonial architecture and planning as it's taught in Dutch academia, and how this topic is addressed beyond Dutch academia. And I'll do that basically from my own experience. So I'll share my experience as an architecture historian, being educated at the VU Free University in Amsterdam, where I graduated, and then I did my PhD at Delft University of Technology. To give you an example, or to illustrate what we're actually talking about, and this is what I very often also bring to mind when I do presentations to any kind of audience, to illustrate how wide a topic colonial architecture and planning are, I sometimes use this map, which is held by the Geographical Institute in Rome. This map indicates all the colonies in Europe in 1941, and in the world in 1941. And this is often very useful, particularly for Dutch people, because they don't really realize often how broad our sphere of influence was from the first days of our, let's say, overseas exploration into overseas territories, be it for trade or to ultimately colonize these countries. So these, for example, this map illustrates where the Dutch from the 1600 to 1800 from time to time, sometimes longer, sometimes shorter, settled itself. So we had the West Indian Company, which is all the blue settlements, and then we had the East India Company, which is all the yellow settlements. And I've indicated some of the countries where we were actually going between 1600 and 1800. And especially for the Dutch, this is very often an eye-opener, because when we talk about the colonies, we always talk about Suriname, Antilles, Indonesia, and sometimes New York, but that was not all. We have been in all the places indicated on this map. And then to shake people even more up, to make them understand how large these territories sometimes were, these two images are very, very often very illustrative. So on the left, you see in gray the map of Europe, and the overlay in red is Indonesia as it was in its final stage of Dutch colonialism, because we didn't immediately from 1600 onwards colonize the entire what is now Indonesia archipelago, but this is what we ended up with in 1942. And if you compare the surface of the Netherlands with the surface of Indonesia on the right, Indonesia is the palm tree and the Netherlands is the small windmill. So those are the, that's how big the territories were that we ultimately tried to rule. And the reason I always think it's important to point this out is because in Dutch architectural history and planning history, and even at and also at technical universities for students who want to become architects or planners, there is very little awareness of what we're actually talking about. And it's not we're talking about small countries, we're talking about large countries where we did have a very big influence when it comes to planning and architecture. So the question, what do we actually discuss in Dutch academia and beyond with regard to colonial and post-colonial architecture and planning, is what I'm going to try and talk about today. So I'll start with Dutch academia. If you generally ask the question, is Dutch academia interested in colonialism and post-colonialism, the answer is yes. Particularly, historians have been addressing this issue for a long time. Not necessarily architecture and planning, or actually not at all architecture and planning, but various aspects of the history and issues related to colonialism and post-colonialism are addressed by historians. For example, 10 years ago, the Royal Netherlands History Society organized this conference called A New Dutch Imperial History. And when I attended this conference, my only one thought was, historians are already ready for a new Dutch imperial history, and architectural historians haven't even begun analyzing or studying architectural colonial history. So we are lagging behind as architectural historians. At the beginning of my presentation, I already mentioned where I was educated as an architectural historian, where I did my PhD. And maybe for some of you, it's helpful for me to explain a little bit about the way curricula for architectural history are organized in the Netherlands, because this is not the same everywhere in the world. In the Netherlands, a degree in architecture history, be that bachelor or master, are never handed out or attained at technical universities. Technical universities, such as the one in Delft, but also Eindhoven and Enschede in the Netherlands, you cannot end up with a degree in architecture history and planning. You do have topics. There is a course in architectural history, but that's basically one of the many topics. But to become an architecture historian proper, as I am, so I am not an architecture who is now interested in the history of architecture. I'm an architectural historian by training. You go to the non-technical universities in the Netherlands. So in the Netherlands, that's part of the humaniora, the alpha sciences, and not the sciences proper. Which sometimes is a bit confusing when I go, for example, to Indonesia, because in Indonesia, there is, as far as I know, no university where you can actually become an architecture historian. I know one university where they do urban history, but even that is slightly different. So that's important maybe to know. And when I was a student in Amsterdam, the curricula covered everything from Greek, Roman architecture, all the way up to the latest postmodern architecture in the 1980s and 90s. But nobody talked about colonial architecture and planning. Not the Netherlands, not European colonial architecture and planning. It wasn't addressed at all. It was not a topic, which struck me, and I only stumbled upon this topic because at the time I worked in a bookshop, and one day a book, a very simple first inventory with an essay in the front, appeared about colonial architecture in Indonesia, and that's what raised my interest in the topic. But it wasn't professors or teachers at the university that brought this up, because they basically never read about it, because there were no books available at the time. We're now talking late 80s, early 90s. This is just an overview of the few lectures I have given over the last 15 years at universities in the Netherlands. So considering the vastness of the territories that are the colonies, the Dutch colonies, it's remarkable that there's only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 lectures over the last 15 years at universities. And the main reason I'm invited to give lectures like this is very often because I either know the lecturer personally, so he or she has heard of my topic and somehow finds a way to squeeze this in within the lecture series, or it is somebody who is a guest lecturer for a while at a university, which, for example, is the case with the 2019 presentation I did in this program called Documenting the Colonial Archive. Then somebody thinks, oh, we had somebody at this university and maybe she can be squeezed into the program. But it's never been a consistent part of any curricula in Dutch universities. So that's the situation in Dutch academia. I would still say that there is very little interest, and if there is any interest, it's basically fairly random and very individually motivated. There is no incentive from the universities, from any university and the departments of architectural history to actually pay some attention to this topic. Beyond Dutch academia, I would say the situation is fairly different. And this is something I noted almost immediately after finishing, my degree at the Free University. I spent 1 year in Indonesia to try and find out what the archives in Indonesia looked like, what people were involved in topics related to colonial architecture and planning. And in Indonesia, I discovered that there were actually a lot of people interested in colonial architecture and planning, predominantly the colonial period, and also predominantly from a preservation point of view. They were concerned that due to economic developments, existing buildings and urban fabrics were under threat of demolition because they needed to make way for new developments. That's also how I very quickly got in touch with ICOMOS and realized that ICOMOS was actually and had been quite active in the field of colonial architecture and planning. One of the scientific committees of ICOMOS was actually called Colonial Architecture and Planning. That was later renamed Shared Built Heritage. And in that scientific committee and the people around it, which were often populated by professionals and predominantly architects, not architecture historians, there was not a huge, but a considerable interest in colonial architecture and planning in general. Dutch, in many of the settlements I showed you in one of the previous slides, but also Indonesia, Suriname, like the really big colonies we the Netherlands hung on to until the very end, until their independence in the 20th century. So ICOMOS for me has much more than academia been an environment where I sort of felt at home because people understood what I was talking about. Although they were not necessarily architecture historians, they did understand the topic because they were also involved and interested in the topic and knew something about this topic. Another project that was initiated outside academia is this book about, say, traces of a colonial past in one of the major cities in the Netherlands, in The Hague, which is where our government resides. And The Hague in the Netherlands sort of is nicknamed the grandchild of Indonesia, because a lot of people who used to work and live in Indonesia, whether they were Dutch, Indonesian, after a while or after independence moved back to the Netherlands and then settled in The Hague. So The Hague is like the widow of Indonesia in a way. That's how it's sometimes also referred to. And the Hague municipality around 2010 decided that maybe it was interesting to analyze what tactile built traces you would actually be able to find in The Hague. And so these two authors, Andrea Kroon and Audrey Wachtberg, then did an inventory of the buildings in The Hague that referred to this past in Indonesia. So Sporen van Smaragd is traces of emerald. Emerald is often the stone connected with Indonesia. So it's anybody who knows anything about Indonesia immediately thinks, oh, this is about Indonesia and traces of Indonesia in The Hague. But again, it was not an initiative taken by academia. It was not academia being involved. Andrea and Audrey are both architecture historians, but this is one of the many projects they do, and they are not only focusing on colonial built heritage. So this was a one-off project for them, but a very in-depth study of what they've done. A very in-depth study of built heritage in The Hague that has a connection with the colonies. A project I was involved with is this project, which is interesting also with regard to this discussion about modernism and how widespread is the modernism, the pre-Second World War modernism. This book was initiated about 10 years ago. It's a research project, and the research project, the aim was to bring a book together, to bring the research together that was actually done for SIAM-4, the fourth SIAM conference that took place in Russia, but the book was never published. The conference was a comparative analysis of 33, I think, cities around the world. And it basically aimed at analyzing city planning and modern city planning. Because the book, for many reasons, was never materialized, the initiators in the Netherlands and Zurich, Switzerland, decided maybe we could do this book by bringing together authors that would study the 33 cities that initially were going to be published in this book that never materialized. And it sometimes felt a bit like I was an oddity in the project. According to the SIAM initial program and book, there were 2 colonial cities were going to be included in the book, which were Dalat in Indochina and Bandung, Indonesia. And so that's what the authors for the book that was published in 2013 also decided to do. So there was one author that dealt with Dalat, and I was the one dealing with Bandung. And what struck me during actually the writing process was that it seemed like there was still some kind of disconnect between, the way the editors of the book thought modernism landed in a colony like the Dutch East Indies. My experience was that the guy in charge of the submission for the book in the 1930s was not very impressed by what SIAM was doing. First of all, because he was fairly unaware of what SIAM was doing, which was a big surprise to the people in 2013 involved in the project. They said, well, surely they were aware. I said, no, they were not. SIAM was not this big thing in the colonies, not least because they didn't think that many of the objectives of SIAM applied to a colonial situation. So, for example, flat roofs in a tropical climate are not necessarily what you want in a tropical climate. And that was already a discussion in the 1930s. And what struck me, it was that I was sometimes still having this discussion with the editors of the book, because they sort of wanted me to suggest that Indonesia at the time was very open to these SIAM ideas, whereas my findings were that they weren't, and that they even didn't necessarily agree with the SIAM principles. So the disconnect that existed in the 1930s, from my point of view, almost seemed to continue until, even now, because there was still some kind of misunderstanding about the relevance of SIAM in a country, for a country like Indonesia, and still a sort of people still seem not able to understand what the problems were. And that's maybe because they don't know enough about what local requirements are in countries like Indonesia, in countries that are in totally different climates. Another project that is not beyond academia, but is beyond Dutch academia I was involved was a COST action. COST is a program funded by the European Union. COST stands for European Cooperation for Science and Technology. So they hand out money, and they allow people to build up networks across Europe, so transnational networks with people that share knowledge on certain topics. That can be science and technology. In our case, I was involved in a project, and so was Edward Gogol. In the project was called Architecture Beyond Europe, European Architecture Beyond Europe. And it involved people who from Italy, Spain, Portugal, basically all European countries, and Israel. And it focused on the architecture these countries built in what were predominantly their colonies. Remarkable again was that I was the only one basically from dealing with Southeast Asia. I was definitely the only one dealing with Indonesia. India was presented, a lot of African countries were presented, South America was presented, but again, Indonesia it wasn't very big, and it also seemed like not a lot of people were aware that there was something like Indonesia, even though Indonesia is a big country and today economically is fairly relevant in that part of the world. But again, I felt a bit like I was the odd one out, although it, on the other hand, also felt like, oh, I'm finally surrounded by architectural historians from other countries who at least know what I'm talking about. We're all interested in colonial architecture. So from that point of view, it was very stimulating, because I was, for the first time after many years, involved in a group of colleagues, architectural historians, with whom I shared an interest, which was colonial and post-colonial planning and architecture. A long-lasting result from this project was the journal you see up below. It's the Architecture Beyond Europe journal, which is an online journal. It's still ongoing. They thematic issues are published from time to time on the website. So if you're interested, you could try and take a look there. Another aspect of beyond academia is, I think, a trend that has been developing rapidly over the last 5 years and sped up incredibly fast over the last 2 years, which is an interest in a topic that is closely connected to colonialism, but doesn't necessarily focus on colonialism in its broadest perspective. But slavery is currently a very hot topic in the Netherlands, and I think worldwide, but also in the Netherlands. And the reason I point this out is because as part of this interest in slavery, quite a few cities, and the main cities in the Netherlands, have taken a lead in this. There are initiatives of tracing links in cities in the Netherlands today to slavery and also colonialism. On the bottom of this slide, you see a few images of guidebooks that have been produced within this framework. They deal with Utrecht and Amsterdam. Groningen, which is in the northeast of the Netherlands, is also starting a research now. And New York, current New York, has also been part of this process. And these are two examples of cities that recently published books about the traces of slavery. So again, this on the left is Utrecht and on the right, Amsterdam. I have recently been involved in a commission that was given by the Rotterdam municipality, who decided 3 years ago actually, that they didn't only want the traces of slavery, but also the colonial past, as I said, in its widest perspective. As a result of that commission to the Royal Institute for Linguistics and Caribbean Studies, KITLV, in Leiden, 3 books were published last year. You see the covers of these books here. And each book addresses a different topic. So the one in the middle by Alex van Stipriaan is solely about slavery. It's basically the culmination of 35 years of research by Alex. So he's really used this opportunity to write everything up that he's found in the last 35 years, or studied in the last 35 years. About slavery and the transatlantic slavery. The book on the left is a combination of, I think it's about 12 authors, and various topics are addressed: economic, missions, so religious issues, and my chapter on tactile built traces in the city of Rotterdam is part of that book. And then the book on the right very much focuses on post-colonial expressions in the city. So that could be street artists, dance, things that go on today, but also including, for example, street language. Today,
Pauline, I think
Yeah.
I think you have to wrap up.
Okay, I will wrap up. Yeah, I'm almost there. Thank you.
Thanks.
So today, this book has been published, which is a summary of the 3 books I showed you before. As you can see on the right, there are a few, that's the table of content. Again, a variety of topics that's being addressed. In terms of valorization and sharing this knowledge with a general audience, because primary schools really do not pay attention to this topic. Similarly, secondary schools don't pay attention, and universities, as I mentioned, also don't do this. But the Open Monument Day this year used my chapter to create a bicycle tour through Rotterdam to share some kind of knowledge and information. So that way, academic knowledge is then spread out and shared with a general audience, I would say, which I think is very exciting and also very necessary. And the World Museum in Rotterdam, also based on this research done by KITLV, is planning an exhibition in 2023 about colonialism or slavery or both. They're still looking for how to go about this, and they've set up a discussion group to discuss what would be an appropriate way to address this issue and share this knowledge that is created in academia with a broader audience. I'll very quickly conclude. I think, first of all, that academia in the Netherlands absolutely lacks serious attention to the topic of colonial and post-colonial architecture and planning. There is no attention to it, which I think is a shame. My second conclusion is that if architecture and planning from the colonies and the post-colonial period are addressed, they're often used as secondary sources and not primary sources, which I, as an architectural historian, sometimes find problematic. So we are used on the books of covers. You see images of cities and a building on the books about slavery in Utrecht and Amsterdam, but it's basically considered apparently a secondary source. And I think we need to strive for colonial architecture and planning as primary sources of research. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Pauline, for this fascinating paper. I think it's really wonderful to see this relationship between the colony and the colonized, especially the awareness. Great, thank you so much. Our next speaker is Valve Lino. Lino is an artist, curator, and co-founding artistic director of Sasa Art Project, Phnom Penh's only Cambodian artist-run space. His artistic and curatorial practices are participatory in nature, exploring communal learning, experimentation, and sharing of multiple voices through exchanges. His interest is in the intersection of micro-histories, notions of community, and the production of social situation. As an artist, he's particularly interested in the agency of human stories and materiality and how the audience engages with them. And he has presented his artworks widely in Cambodia, as well as internationally, including major exhibitions and festivals such as Asia Pacific Triennium and the Biennial of Sydney, and at institutions such as Museum of Contemporary Arts Taipei or the Gallery of Modern Arts Brisbane, and so on. So as a curator, Lino is interested in the mobility of material and immaterial goods across places and times, and what is produced or transformed from its mobility. So Lino today will talk about arts pedagogy, experimentation, and making, mediating agency with and in the white building community. Lino, please.
Thank you so much, Bo-Peng, for the generous introduction. Thank you to Sally, Moritz, Edward, and Christian for the invitation for this seminar. So today I will share with you a story from Sasa Art Project, in particular an episode that we were working with the white building community. First, I want to start by stating the fact of the context that I'm talking from. So I'm speaking from a place where freedom of speech is a luxury, and the tackling of avenues for free speech was escalated in the late 2010s, before 2020, and to the dissolution of the main opposition party in 2017. I'm also talking from a place where the urbanization is extremely rapid. The reclamation, or in fact the dissolution of the natural resources and spaces for urban development is very rampant, and the price of the land is lucrative. Also, I'm talking from a place where the only formal art institution in the country that teaches art, there's only one state university. We have very few art spaces and galleries, most of which are focusing on exhibition making. So all of this also, sorry, there's another one that is important. I'm talking from a community where we suffer from a traumatic history of the Khmer Rouge, in which about 90% of the intellectuals, including artists, architects, were executed or died from that regime. So we are talking from a place where there is this big gap of continuity of knowledge and the transfer of the knowledge between generations. So me and together with my collective, we are called Steel Salapa, that we formed in 2007. And we were thinking about how we can continue our practice. So we are an art collective of photographers, painters, videographer, a mix of art trained or self-trained. And we were thinking about how we could continue our practice, engage with our community, trying to deal with this gap of the knowledge transfer, and how to engage with the current generation and the next about art. So we came to find out about this amazing place called the White Building, or originally known as Municipality Apartment, that was built in the 1960s, in that period of the post-independence, and also a period of an escalated modernization and urbanization, a period of defining a new cultural language of, as you may know, like many other newly independent states. And so this was designed by a Cambodian architect, Louis Banhart. He was trained in France, together with an engineer, Vladimir Budiansky. And they adapted this project from previous Budiansky work. And so it's the very first model of modern apartment style social housing introduced in Cambodia. And it was part of a larger project, a compound complex called Basak Riverfront, or Front du Basak, which composed of multiple facilities, including residentials as well as cultural facilities. And it was built on a reclaimed land by the water, by the water. So thinking about this, the legacy of this history as an experimental social reconstruction, and a new vision to bring public and culture together in a physical urban space. And that was something that was really striking for us. And we as an art collective, we decided to revisit this place. This what it looked like in 2014 as the community, resettle in this neighborhood. So after the Khmer Rouge, people returned back to the city. And among the very first people to move into this neighborhood were the survived artists from the Khmer Rouge regime. And the community grew back again from that artistic community to attract more very diverse community there across generations. And we thought that would be so interesting. It's very rich context, very rich historical legacy, and also very rich populations and knowledge that is dense in this physical space. We decided to start social art projects in 2010, exploring different forms of art engagement, except exhibitions. And one of the things that we where we start at first right away was doing classes and workshops. From very basic, drawing, photography, object making, image making, working with students from the neighborhood and beyond, to utilize this, artistic form, to talk and speak about whatever they wanted to talk, and to some very practical projects where students learn with drawing and paintings and transform that into a renovation project in their own community, transforming the image and the look of the neighborhood, etc. We also engage with artists, visiting artists that share different kind of skills, either practical skills or historical knowledge about the neighborhood history of the site, to various way, and engaging with artists from mostly Southeast Asia that came to do residency with us, basically. And our art classes sort of became and evolved over time and became more and more complex. As the student grew, we also how could we continue to develop our art classes that respond, to that growth of the students. And I will talk more later about that, the philosophy and some key ideas about our education program. But just want to show you some of the example of the work by the students. For example, Rado did this sound bicycle project that he rode around the city, interviewing people and broadcasted it, through his bicycle. So it's sort of like a citizen messenger, passing the message from one neighborhood to another. And some of the students, they form into a collective to produce micro stories from their neighborhood, into, and compile and share it on this archive, where you actually can find materials produced by students or artists or the like. Mostly is a visual and audio work that we hope that gives some sort of stories and a holder for some of the stories from this very important neighborhood. And also one of the other things that we are pushing for is that we engage with the students as well as the artists and the residents to together make things happen. So for example, students negotiated with a coffee shop, by the street side and transform it into a community cinema screening work produced by the students themselves from our classes or by the other artists from elsewhere. So connecting, the material output from the art classes to something that can be shared and transforming space inside this neighborhood to where people can interact and experience those materials, either the street or hair salon, to the rooftop with the artists and residents from the neighborhood, to rock band concert, to video art. So activating different aspects of these communal spaces of this building to be basically, you know, I don't want to use that word, but yes, you know, it's a platform for sharing and engaging with the art. Some of the works also the students were trying to not just share in the white building neighborhood, but to outside further. This was an example that they did. They experimented with this food seller from the neighborhood by putting their video work on that food cart, and then, you know, he would push it into the night, into the city. So, you know, spreading out that video and video work by the student to just, you know, random strangers in the cities or to the park. Some artists and residents did research, and, you know, in this case, it was Panya, Panya, who's an urbanist and architect, and she researched the evolution or genealogy of this neighborhood, looking at both architecturally but socially, and how people adapt, use the space over time. And this was the part of the research process that he talked with the residents. I have so many images, so I will maybe not to tell everything because of time, but just highlight some of the things that I think about education and pedagogy, connecting with the experimentation, connecting with how we, you know, make that community alive and engaged. And so this one, for example, a group of young people, they wanted to renovate their own neighborhood. They wanted to, you know, repaint these white to this staircase, because it's like, you know, it's so dark and grim, and people threw out trashes and so on. So I thought, okay, then of course, let's do this together. And so we were like cleaning up this and repainted it all back to white as it was original. And so my contribution was to put this lighting and radio work. So using motion sensor, people, when they walk up the staircase, you know, it was activated, sort of creating this friendly space for the residents. So some of the key ideas that we were thinking through, you know, while we were working there, is thinking about how we could reclaim history. And in this case, you know, the idea of the white building and the Basak Riverfront, to, you know, it was an ideological project. It was a state ideology, but how can we reclaim that and rework in this contemporary context? We think about how we can facilitate dialogue and use that as a transformative process where people could speak, talk, and make things for their own community. And that is very much part of what we believe is these agencies, where people talk and make decisions how they want to imagine and utilize their own spaces and how they want to interact together. And to me, is a form of micro democracy, and that is so central and that is so important part of this exercise of Cambodian people in this political climate. And as well, you know, trying to think about how we can fill that gap in the art education while bringing our colleagues and peers and artists from nearby regions with us. And most of the things that we were doing there were transient. So it's short-lived, and it infused and disrupt this fabric of everyday life. And it's about collective learning, and that we offer different ways for the people and the communities to engage with, either as audience, either as co-organizers, either as artists. So that way we have more like a very dynamic way of coexistence. Unfortunately, the white building was knocked down for new development in 2017. And I did this project by collecting and asking for donation of those spirit houses from the residents, and the residents were helping me collecting those as well. And I transformed it into an art project to think and to put forward this testimony and the resilience and the recollection and reconstruction of the spirits of this community. And together, it's for me, it's this collective history, collective spirit and stories from this very important community. I want to conclude by quickly sharing about the new Sosa Art project. This was a new space, and we transformed the space over time. The looks keep changing, but at the new space, we still focus on education program as part of our main program. We believe that is so central ways to engage with young people, to engage with young artists. And our education program has two parallel approach. So on the one hand is art making, right? It's straightforward. You make art through these classes, and but on the another level is about building critical consciousness and building a more an interdisciplinary knowledge. So people were participating in this series of workshop where we discussed different disciplines with guest speakers, either geography, anthropology, art history. In the end, we believe that kind of knowledge will last and will serve critically for the students, whether they became artists or not, or whether they continue to be artists or not. So just want to share some of the images of the space in different configurations, either exhibition, talks, discussions, or workshops, and the kind of audience that we engage with in the space. So in the one last minute, I just want to share with this briefly of this project. And why? Because I think what we learned from the white building was so central, and that allowed us to think about that in the city scale. So this Phnom Penh Art and Urban Festival Currents that I co-curated with my colleague Pansare Panya, we think about the city as is the whole platform to engage with exhibition making, event making. And so from 18 venues and looking at communal spaces such as Ali Lane, shop house, Buddhist temple, a former backyard and whatnot, where actually people informally interact and exchange and form relationships. And so we staged mini exhibitions to performances, workshops, and film screening, the like. And so this is what it was like in different places across the city. So I'm just going to run through the image. This was an archival exhibition of Cambodian cinema in this Ali Lane next to a former cinema. An exhibition about the garment industry and creative ways to use public or the interface between private and public spaces inside this shop house, near the market, video sound workshops, a performance on this Ali Lane, to discussion about theme from Southeast Asia, screening, pop-up exhibition in this vacant house in this very fast-changing complex to talk about the urban changes and how we are conscious about this, to the concluding event of performance by the riverside, taking the element of the city, the air, the wind, water, and fire as a platform and stage for the performance. So thank you. We'll end with this one. And if you have any question, I'm happy to answer at the end.
And thank you very much, Lino. I'm now stepping in for a moment for Hua Peng, and I have the great pleasure to announce the upcoming speakers. But really, first of all, I would really like to thank you again, Lino, for this amazing presentation and sharing your impressions from Phnom Penh. I think the work of Zaza Art Projects, beginning with your practice in the White Building, how you engage people, how you kind of interchange knowledge with different kind of communities, was extremely inspiring for our project and also for thinking about the symposium today. It also stands in relation to some other projects that were important to us, like the Haus der Statistik. And I think it's really like what you're doing as a hub or model for engaging and the idea of agency in connection to our theme of modernist architecture, but to a kind of community of people living in these buildings. And it's also interesting that you now try to scale it to a city level. And I think somehow we can also think further on this question of the city in connection to learning and modernist architecture. And this also leads us to our next speaker. She will talk about the city as a living room, Ute Meta-Bauer. I'm extremely happy that she can join the talk today because she was super busy in the last days, weeks, months, and I'm not wondering why, because I think she's such an important connector of the art, architecture, and research communities in countries in Southeast Asia, but also Europe and the US. And so we were very lucky to have you in our broader team of contested modernities. You were also bringing us in connection to Ruang Rupa. So finally, we were able to do a curatorial project in the Good School in Jakarta, which was a really fundamental project about rethinking education and learning about the postcolonial situation in some of the Southeast Asian countries and how to question the official narrations and learn about how to bring in new positions. So I would, it's not my part now to talk about all this. We can maybe later do it in the final discussion, but I would like to introduce you briefly. And there are also so many things you did in your life. So I just make a selection. Right now, you're professor at the NTU School of Art and Design and Media in Singapore, and also founding director of the NTU Center for Contemporary Art in Singapore. You have been curator and educator in different leading positions at the Royal College of Art in London, at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, at the Documenta, the Berlin Biennale, and the Venice Biennial, to name just a few. And currently you are working as a co-curator for the next Istanbul Biennale alongside David T. and Ama Kanwa. And also you're curating the Singapore Pavilion for the next Venice Biennial, and that is featuring the artist Shu Bigi Rao. And you hosted our symposium in Singapore at the CCA, which focused on international and transdisciplinary research practices. I think this is also connected to what we are talking about today. And there, one person that you referenced many times to was William S. Lim. And now we are very much looking on your perspective on his form of education and practice. Ute, please.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you also really to Sally and Moritz, Eduard and Christian, and of course the whole team of Contested Modernities. As you hear, I mean, I'm from Germany, so I'm not exactly an expert in architecture nor in Southeast Asia. I'm kind of an observer here. And I think I had a big privilege with our center to host many artists in our residencies, but also to look up what has happened in this very interesting region, also after World War II, after the Cold War, and it's still, I think, a gap in a Western context. I think it was really very interesting to listen to Pauline and also to bring back the notion of the Batavia, of the kind of colonial histories. Yeah, like to look into the slave trade and maybe a little bit a darker side, which continued in a certain way in what Lino just mentioned, also the later histories of the Khmer Rouge, Vietnam, in Laos. So I think we are indeed in a contested modernity. And I was so busy the last weeks because our center also kind of like got shuffled over. So, but I learned very much, I would say, from people like Willy Lim, but also on others, is to create archives. So we worked very much in the past months of working on our archive to leave some traces for researchers later of things that very quickly disappear in our region. But I will now share the screen, if that is possible. How do I do that?
I'm on the green button right in the middle of the screen down below. Usually it's there. There,
Yeah,
very good. Thank you.
Yeah, so really thank you all from so many places in this region. We hardly see each other because of COVID. So I haven't seen Lino in a while. I had the pleasure of really seeing the activities in the White Building, and I think also, as you mentioned, Ruang Grupa, and I think one has to understand this region really in its rapid transitions, and why William Lim was so important for me, and also I think in relation to his peers, is they experienced this region in a moment of a massive transition of colonial power to independence, into the Cold War, I would say into neo-colonial structures, into globalization, into new governments that maybe were starting very hopeful. But then, as we see recently in Myanmar, in Cambodia, and so are really falling back to very autocratic regimes in Indonesia, maybe a bit less. But if you look up in the Philippines, and I think this we cannot leave out of sight. So I think it's, to me, again, is very interesting we did a book after the show on Willy Lim, and it's not necessarily an exhibition on Willy Lim, but Willy as a figure of a certain period of time, as an architect, as a theorist, as a humanist, as a very active and inspired person, and who literally came back from his education as an architect to the region. He is born in Hong Kong in 1932. He's 89 at this moment. And he and his peers, they really were very hopeful in shaping new societies. And it's very interesting, a colleague also from NOS, Chiat Wei Chang, he looked into the networks basically of tropical architecture, and it's not like, unlike Southeast Asian art history, it's actually not taught here in the region. So the AA in London has been very important in the years from 1954 to 72, offering courses in tropical studies in architecture. And then also the University of Melbourne, like 1960 to 1970, had courses in tropical architecture. Other places have been in Ghana, in Africa, Namibia. And I think it's, I have to see how I move forward. Okay, so it's also particular people who started to look into this: Jane Drew, Maxwell Fry, Otto Königsberger, and Jiat Wei Chang actually did a study and a research for us for the book, The Impossibility of Mapping Urban Asia, which we did after the exhibition of Willy. The exhibition of Willy focused very much on this kind of network. You mentioned it, the city as a living room. I met Willy in his living room, where he always hosted salon style, so many people from different disciplines. He has this very hybrid kind of like practice, looking into theater, literature. He always has been like involved in all of this with his wife, Lena Lim, who started Select Books, a very important independent publishing house, with a bookstore later, with a cafe in it. So I think it's really interesting to look into those networks, because these people were connected, and they were in a debate with others, as other kind of like intellectuals, groups, etc. So when we did this exhibition, it was basically to honor Willy kind of at his 85th birthday, and literally because nobody else did it. So I'm not an expert, but I felt he's such an inspiring person. He has started so many projects, mainly also, I have to say, literature projects, magazines, journals, books, associations. So the architecture that he built, I would call, is really an architecture of discourse rather than just the built environment. And so what we did, we used another of Willy's principles, and that is the notion of upcycling. So all of our exhibition architecture that was being put together by the architect Laura Miotto, who teaches exhibition design at our university, she used all of our exhibition furniture that we had, plinths and like screens, etc., and upcycled them to the architecture, to this giant living room that we created, and that was full with the journals, the projects he was involved. We had a film program curated about, not about Willy, not about the groups he was involved, but about this rapid changing urban Asia that is really, I would say, beyond China, maybe has been in most rapid transformation since the 80s. And Willy also had been already involved in a project in the mid-90s, curated by Hans-Ulrich Obrist and Hu Han Ru, called Cities on the Move, which really dealt with these fast changes. Willy Lim, as I said, is born in 92 in Hong Kong. He moved then later after his studies to Singapore, where he is married to Singaporean Lena Lim. As I said, like after also the AA in London, he moved to the Harvard Graduate School of Design, where he also met with or were taught by Jacqueline Turvitt, which is very interesting, who's an urban planner, very interesting, very, I would say, radical and inspiring urban planner. And I think that also put the seeds into kind of like certain of his ideas. And so this here you see it, like, so we had like brought back drawings from the Spurs group. We had different curators like Shirley Surya, who is an architecture historian and curator at M+, looked into the vast amount of Willy's publications or involvement in publications. We had, sorry, it's like difficult to move forward. Try to find my here cursor. We had Leon Sheikh, who is architect based and who taught in Melbourne, and who is a close friend of Willy. And as you see already, their planning of architecture is less like traditional architecture planning, but looking into the celebration of life, looking into a celebration of being together in a city. And this is also why we called this exhibition Incomplete Urbanism. So Willy said the urbanism is a built environment, but it's not complete. It's only complete by what we saw with Lino, by activities of people in it. It is a lived architecture, to come back to Lefebvre. And so I think this was also kind of what inspired me so much. I don't know that cursors are always disappearing. Okay. So what we had, we really focused in this moment also to bring together the publications, which are very difficult to find and not easily accessible. And a lot of ideas are embedded in them. And this is why I think it's so, as you all mentioned, yes, there is the education somewhere, but where are the traces? Where do we find these materials? And this is why I think your project on contested modernities is so relevant and it's so timely, because a lot of this material is so fragmented at so many different places and very hard to get access to. So I just show a number of the examples. I mean, for example, acoustics, the problems of science of human settlements. So there was this kind of new community of architects who really looked up like what are these societies in which they are working into, what is happening in these moments of transition. Another magazine, Monsoon magazine, is also very interesting because it's a literary magazine that looked into the identity of the Malay world, for which Willy served as an editor and also as a writer. So this kind of like collaboration, not only within your own peers, your own discipline, that was what really fascinated me on Willy's practice. Then he, as I said, he was involved in numerous groups, amongst them the Southeast Asia Study Group. So they looked in really questioning the development in this region, like how to get people out of poverty. They were looking into mass transportation, moving airports. I mean, for example, they proposed to put the airport from the inner city out to Changi, which is now today one of the biggest airports in the world. And so it's really interesting how it goes from the micro level really to the macro level. Another project is MIMAR, Architecture in Development, which was supported by the Aga Khan Trust for Architecture. They had about 43 issues in total, and those who are interested, they all are downloadable online. They're all scanned and are accessible. And it's really interesting to understand more about tropical architecture. So MIMAR really engages across the world, kind of like Africa, India, and so like looking into a kind of like a different modernity. They did not yet see it as a contested modernity, maybe, but as a tropical or as an alternative modernity. Yeah, and then the book that we published, Incomplete Urbanism, and then the impossibility of mapping urban Asia. We have a number of scholars like Kun Wei, who also has been part of your project, who's teaching Singaporean, who's teaching architecture in Hong Kong. And he looked really in this emergent modern Asian modernism in the forms of its think tanks and this notion of designing a new environment. So it was never just about like the housing, etc. It was really much more in terms of urban planning to be understood. Yeah, you see here again, like some of the drawings, the future of Asian cities. I mean, they really were thinking big, but if you look up the group SPORE, Singapore Planning and Urban Research Group, which started kind of like 65 to 67, before Singapore even got really founded as a nation state. You see already the scale. I mean, here you have kind of like a little idea of Golden Mile, which also already was mentioned, which was seen. And on the right side, you see shop houses. And so you see the scale of like the kind of like 1-2 story shop house buildings, and then this massive new architecture, which doesn't look very elegant, I would say almost scary looking, but they understood already there will rapid population growth, there will be in need of very different infrastructures, and they were kind of thinking bold. And I would say in a much more positive kind of outlook than what we see today. Maybe if we see a city like Singapore or other big cities that transform so quickly that a lot of heritage has been lost. What is again very interesting that Willy then was also involved in the foundation of the Singapore Heritage Society that looked into what is getting lost. On the one side, they were planning this kind of new cities of the future, but then they realize, or also Willy and his peers realize, a lot gets also lost in this process. So it's this ambiguity, it's this kind of like, as Lino said, like Yang Molivan and his peers, they were building together with the king of Cambodia, these modern cities, but that already eroded other forms of architecture. And today we are mourning the loss of those modern buildings that are entering a very different, I would say, nondescript kind of Nova architecture. Yeah, you see here, this is kind of Golden Mile extended. What we see today, there's one building, but they imagined many of those buildings. Like, as you see, the layers of subways, of traffic. I mean, it's pretty scary if one looks this up. And that was a concept sketch of our cities of tomorrow. And it really showed the intense density and these kind of linear structures of future Asian cities as the Singapore Planning and Urban Research Group had imagined in these days. Here you see, it's actually People's Park was also mentioned already, People's Park Complex that was built 1967 till 73 by design partner, the design partnership architects, of which Willy was one of the founding members. He left later. They're still active until today, one of the biggest architecture and development groups here still in Singapore. And here you see People's Park, which was kind of like, I would say, maybe more successful than the cities of Le Corbusier, which also had like shopping malls, kindergartens, and combining housing with infrastructures, and I think which caters much more to the Asian way of life. And you see here Golden Mile, which was really the first of its kind, and then later extended by Golden Mile, where you have shops in the first like 3 floors, you have in the basements, food courts and markets, and then you have like housing above, parking and other infrastructures, and it's still there. I hope it stays for a little while longer. And you have here also the People's Park Scholarship Fair, which is also active until today, which gives gives people of all walks of lives support. And of course, it's run today by the PAP, by the party that is still ruling Singapore. And what is very interesting, and I want to end here also, is 1973, SPUR got dissolved. They were, as I said, supporting the government, having dialogues, advised them in moving the airport to Changi, looking into the MRT, the mass rapid transport system, etc. But they also had a critical perspective. And I think they got more and more in conflict with the government's plan, and there were more tensions. And already in 73, the group got dissolved. And what is very interesting to me that Willy did not build so much anymore afterwards in Singapore. And he also did not teach really here. So he was teaching mainly abroad, here and there. But what for me is his architectural education and legacy are the publications, are the think tanks, and are the society he was forming. So I think we cannot just look at the academic institutions that are teaching. We have to look into these archives, these smaller projects, this kind of like micro developments that we have are not just at hand. And I think what groups like Sasa Basak do, or Ruang Rupa with Good School, I think these are very important spaces where a lot of new thinking and new pedagogies is also seeded. In this respect, I thank you so much, and I hope we can discuss a bit more later.
Thank you very much, Ute. Wow. Thank you for your insight into the work of William Lim, but also letting us know about his kind of extra academic environments of learning. And I think this is something we should also discuss in the talk later on and intensify a little bit. So the next presentation will be also about a kind of legendary figure from Indonesia this time, namely Yusuf Bilyarta Mangunwijaya. I hope I spelled it right. Better known maybe or more commonly known as Romo Mangun. And this name dropped quite a lot during our project, and he was also always kind of referred as the architecture priest, and it became like a little bit mystical what this person is about. And finally I had the chance to see one of his major projects in Yogyakarta, but at the same time I also had the fantastic opportunity to meet Eko Pravoto, another, I would say, kind of legendary figure in Yogyakarta, and we had a fantastic conversation whole afternoon in his house about colonial modernism and architecture and life and building and education. And so I also figured out that he was a student by Romo Mangun, and also wrote about him and taught about him. And Eko has his own architectural practice, and I'm very happy that you kind of now let us know a bit about Romo Mangun, but I think you will also bring in some sorts of your own architecture and practice also as a lecturer and scholar. So I'm happy to introduce you briefly. You received the BA from Gajah Mada University in 1982 and made your master then at Berlage Institute in Amsterdam in the Netherlands. So also a cosmopolitan kind of education. So since 1985, you have been a lecturer at the Faculty of Architecture and Design of Duta Wakana Christian University in Yogyakarta. In 2000, Eko Pravoto established the Eko Pravoto Architecture Workshop, and Pravoto mostly works on small-scale projects such as private homes, art galleries, community facilities, as well as art installations and community art projects. I also saw a Buddhist school by you, so also school and educational architectures and spaces. So one of his central design strategies is enhancing locality in order to integrate architecture with social, cultural, and environmental contexts. And his works have been shown at the Venice Biennial, the Gwangju Biennial, Echigo Tsumari Art Triennial, Kamikatsu Art Festival, the Regional in Austria, the Singapore Biennial, among many other places. So I'm looking forward to your talk, and please welcome Eko Pravoto.
Yeah, thank you, Christian. Yeah, tonight I will share the work mainly about Father Mangunwijaya, not about my work. Well, I think it's important to discuss his work rather than my work, I think. In the last few years, as a practicing architect, I'm thinking that it seems in Indonesia, we are more busy with architecture production rather than thinking about discourses in architecture. And sometimes I remember about his work, about his teaching, about his words, and I make a reflection upon that kind of thinking. And it seems that everything's still very much the same with 20, 30 years ago, and he's still active as an architect. And for me, it's quite inspiring. I learned a lot from him, and I've been in contact with him maybe more than 20 years. So this is what I would like to share with you all, and hopefully I can make a clear about what is in his mind or the relevance of his work. Although I may speak more with picture rather than with words, I think. I will begin with what I feel that the course of history is never run as a single massive stream as it might look sometimes. Maybe the media able to highlight about something which is happening, but actually it's not only single thing which is happening. It's always a kind of stream or spectrum, or maybe more like an interwoven layer that interconnected directly to the reality of life. So it's not only about architecture as discourse, but it's actually more about life itself. And it seems to me this is what is happening with the course of modernity or modernism. And today we talk about contested modernities, which in my opinion, we talk about the different kind of modernity, which is happening in different places, different time, by different people. I feel like every time it passes in a certain territory and time, the mixture is happening. The process of infusion and absorption, infiltration, pressure and rejection, adoption and negotiation, mixture and addition is always along the way. So it never pure, so to say. It always related with the context, with the real life, which is become the main ingredient actually. So the discourse is not such as the only important things, but it is influences the life itself. So the modernity, I believe it is a powerful movement, which is already happening actually since the Dutch East Indies era back then. And it has a long and complex mixtures. Then from the turmoil movement toward independence, then the struggle to find a new identity is like try to prove that we are as a new nation able to do the same more or less with other nation, and in a way it's also a kind of a struggling how to maintain the cultural richness, as we all might know that Indonesia consists of maybe 500 or more than 500 ethnic groups with their own building traditions or architecture, so to say. So, but now become one nation. So we are still struggling with how we deal with it. So many different in cultural legacies, so to say. Then now it's we also dream of the future of Indonesia, and also try to make a new or reposition in the global context. We also part of the Asian region or Asia, or also the world citizen, so to say. And but at the same time, we also have another layers of identity, and this kind of ingredient or mixture until now, how we are doing architecture. And Father Mangunwijaya is play a very important role in this cultural formation, especially in the field of architecture. Well, modern architecture, because she is has a many title actually, different kind of title. Not only as an architect, but a priest, educator, writer, and many other things. And in the last few years, after he passed away in 1999. So it's almost it's more than 20 years ago. It seems that his thinking is kind of disappearing, sadly. But in the last few years, many among his friends especially try to bring his thought coming up again by series of discussion and revisiting his work, and try to talk about about his work and digging up more about his thinking. And we find out that it is still very, very relevant. So I'm very happy to share with you about what I know about him, which I think it would be very inspiring. He was born in 1929 and he passed away in 1999. He was a student army and then become a priest, and then the church sent him to study architecture, and then he came back, become educator, and then writer, because he feel not very satisfied with the architecture practice at the time, and he is more become a humanitarian activist until he passed away in 1999. I will share with you some of his projects, not all of his projects, because he did something like maybe 80 projects in total, or maybe a little bit more. But I just choose some of his project, which is really important or really give a kind of new insight in doing architecture in Indonesia. The first is the Maria Assumpta Church, which is he designed in 1967 and finished in 1968, I think. This is a very important project that he did, I think. The reason he studied architecture is actually he was asked by the church to study architecture, because at the time the Monsignor feels that the Catholic as a religion is always considered as a foreign or Western religion. One of that thing is because of the church architecture looks very European. So it doesn't, local people does not feel that it is part of their life or daily life. And this church is one of his project or his work after he returned from Aachen, Germany. The idea of this project is a kind of try to find symbols which relate the idea of the church with the reality of social life. The structure of this church consists of two main pillars, which one is symbolizes government, and the other one is symbolizes the church. So the church building, according to his theology, so to say, it should supported by two main power, which is the church and the government. And the structure is very much like a 10, although it is still trust structure, but the expression is very much like a 10. And the ceiling is like hanging in the space. And what is important in this church is he tried to change the theology, which is usually the placement of the cross is on the highest point. So it's like glorifying the priest, so to say, or the cross. Well, the cross still should be glorified, but the role of the priest, he make a kind of new interpretation or new suggestion, actually. And in most of his church, he placed the place for the altar, or the place where the priest standing is always on the lowest ceiling. So the ceiling is like goes up like this and then going down, and on the lower ceiling he placed the altar. It's not placing the altar on the highest ceiling, but on the lower ceiling. And he did it on purpose because he wanted to say that as a priest, it is more like a servant rather than the ruler or the king. So this is very, very interesting in my opinion, how he is not only proposing the church as more like related with Indonesian culture or Indonesian climate, but it's also try to make a suggestion with the church that how the church should be play a role in the community. And he used some of leftover wood, for instance, for the table, which it also symbolizes the moment when the Abraham tried to sacrifice the Isaac, I think, and put it on a kind of wood which is supposed to be how to say, like a firewood or something. And the opening on the wall, it symbolizes the light, which is enlightenment, which is come to the womb. And other interesting features is every aspect and the detail actually based on the ordinary living of the people. So he used like in terms of ornament, he tried to localize this kind of symbol from the Bible into the visually. It's very, very local. And in this church, he makes so many detail. Almost every part is touched by unique detail. So the tectonic of this church is amazing. So every joint, every meeting point of every element, he put the articulation. So the ornament sometimes like a bird or fire, or fire. Of course, it symbolizes the Holy Spirit. And this is the column, the ornament. The shepherd is also localized or Indonesianized using the white hat and again this painted glass actually. It's the visual impact is very similar to the stained glass, but actually it's painted by himself, I think. But now it's faded away after so many years. He used also a terracotta, so it is a kind of prefabricated things, but not from the big industry, but it's a local craft. So he accommodating the local craft, the local skill with industrial method to create a component for this church. This is the second church, I think, built after 10 years, more or less, after a small chapel, actually, which in a way he used the structure, the wooden structure of a vernacular house, but then he decorated in such a way that you don't feel that this is a vernacular architecture. So it's more like decorated and ornate with the expression of joyfulness, celebration of Christ, of course. And sadly, this church is already torn down, and I don't know, because maybe it's a wooden structure. Of course, it's very difficult to rebuild it again. But it seems that there is a shift in the church, that the idea of indigenization or try to relate with the local is not very much popular anymore now. I don't know, maybe it's not because of the church, but usually the process of the church building is very much now given to the community themselves. While now the community seems not really understand, so to say, about doing theology in a contemporary situation, but it's more than following building the church and following more the global trend rather than try to relate with the local cultures or local aesthetic or local expression, as he did for so many years. This from other view. The ornament is about the tree of life, or sometimes we could see it as a flame or as a fire, symbolizes the Holy Spirit. It's all from wood, cladded from wood, I think, and then painted. This church is actually surrounded by the painted glass done by himself, and I don't know if I have the detail. Yeah, Lucy. So the detail is try to give interpretation how the story from the Bible is localized. It's about the birds, and some of the verses also written. And of course, some decoration on the wall. You see the bird, the Holy Spirit, and in other part like grape or this wheat and so on. Yeah, you see the grape, bird, Holy Spirit, wheat. Next to that building, but he also, what is interesting in his architecture is try to think about the future of Indonesia, which is not related directly to the ethnic group architecture, which I think this is quite new in a way, because in most of the architecture school at that time, we still try to relate how to bring the local or the ethnic architecture into contemporary architecture. And the method we are doing that is more like transforming the form, and it's more about the visual identity rather than to find out the principles, the universal values, or the justification how the form should relate with the surrounding, with the climate, and with the geographic aspect. And this is what he did actually. He tried to make a new form in a way, using a new method of structure, but accommodating the local materials. Like in this case, stone of river, and then this flat fiber cement board. But he still try to relate with a steel house, but not quite the same. And also a lot of opening, which is it is fit with hot and climate locally, and a lot of a craft, I think, craftsmanship, but not in the sense of decoration, but in the science of honesty in using the materials and showing the structure system. This is some detail of the window, which is very, very functional, comfortable, but yet looks very, very modern and rational. But at the same time, it's crafted beautifully, so you can feel this is done by hand. It's not like the aesthetic, industrial aesthetic of modern architecture, but it's still you feel the warmth of the work of hand. This the detail of the stone pillars. The courtyard, the continuation of the relationship with the garden. The element of the water is used a lot of in some of his other design, and he used also wood, but also and also bamboo, but in a different way with vernacular way, I think. From other side of the building, the detail. He invented a lot of detail. How creatively he make mechanism, which is, it looks like part of the industrial component, but actually he do it manually.
Echo, I think you have to wrap up, please.
Okay. Yes. Yeah, this is some of the bamboo application in his design. And what is interesting, he tried to accommodate the leftover of the cement floor tile with a very creative way. Some detail, again, use again the leftover materials, and he composed it beautifully. So it's also the spirit of the church, who never throw away people, but instead of try to collect all together all the people. This is the Sendang Sono, the pilgrimage, which he designed this for quite a long time, maybe in the span of more than 15 years. So it's gradually he add this part and other part. And which is very important, I think, the chapel of the 12 disciples. It's a new interpretation of the open air chapel. Some details. And one of the most important project is the Kampung Kalijode, which he tried to propose a different way of dealing with urban poor rather than forced eviction or demolition. He tried to propose to government, try to give a chance, because he believed that even poor people has the capacity to improve, to develop themselves. This is what's happening now. And this is one of the other important project is his own house, his office actually. And this is a kind of ever-growing house. So he make a modification and addition from 1 story to 3 story. So again, it's also demonstration of the interesting method with also creative detailing, with very simple and almost feel like a Zen Buddhism in terms of detailing. I think it's very, very refined and very quiet compared to his early works. He often said that architecture is only a tool, a media. What is important is how to humanize human being through architecture. And today, the context is very much still the same, I think. The widening the economic gap, the environmental crisis, and then the urbanization. And it also the pressure, the global pressure, the pressure of the need of the reorientation of architecture education. And what he proposed actually try to replace the word architecture, because for him architecture is only consists of a part of the truth. So he proposed Vastu. Vastu is more the holistic approach in seeing architecture, but it's more related with the life in a rather complex situation. And in that book, actually, he wants to say this is also a form of architecture, that the architecture should also consider this is part of their own practice, that we have to focus also in our practice how to erase this urban phenomena, especially the poor people in the urban setting, but without the demolition or forced eviction, as he already gave sample in the Kalijode. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Eko Pravoto, for this first brief insight into this amazing work, and we are looking forward to learn more about it. I pass back the word to Puai Peng, and he will introduce our next speaker.
Thank you, Christian. Our next speaker is Martino Celi. He is the Philip Johnson Chief Curator of Architecture and Design at the Museum of Modern Arts, New York, a role he assumed in March 2015. Martino oversees the wide-ranging program of special exhibitions, installations, and acquisitions of the Department of Architecture and Design. He's the author of Montage and Metropolis, Architecture, Modernity, and the Representation of Space, and Las Vegas in the Real View Mirror, the City in Theory, Photography, and Film, published by Getty Research Institutes. He has organized and co-curated exhibitions on a variety of topics, including the International Traveling Exhibitions of Las Vegas Studio, images from the archive of Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown, the architecture of Hedoism, 3 villas in the island of Capri, and so on and so forth. So at the MoMA, he co-curated the exhibitions toward a concrete utopia, architecture in Yugoslavia, 1948 to 1980, which actually I have a copy of the book and the catalog. It's very beautiful. And also the exhibitions on the renew, reuse, recycle, recent architecture from China. He also oversaw the new installations of architecture and design collections galleries in the new expanded MoMA, which opened in October 2019. Well, I mean, that's a very, very long bio, but I think we'll stop here. Martino, your topic today is the Project of Independence, Architectures of Decolonization in South Asia, 1947 to 1985. All yours, Martino.
Yeah, thank you so much for the kind introduction and also for the invitation to speak here in this symposium. I am going to present an ongoing research project, which is going to be an exhibition next spring at the Museum of Modern Art. I just shared my screen. Please let me know if you have issues seeing it. Otherwise, I assume that you can see my screen now.
It's good. Can you put it the full screen?
Yes, I can. Absolutely. Is this better?
Thank you.
Excellent.
Yeah,
okay, so the Project of Independence, Architectures of the Decolonization in South Asia, 1947 to 1985, is an exhibition that will open to the public on February 20th of next year, and it explores the architectural production in the second half of the 20th century in a region that we would maintain served as a blueprint for independence from colonial rule across the globe. So what exactly do we mean by South Asia? For the purposes of our exhibition, we are defining the region as comprised of what had formerly been British India and the Crown Colony of Ceylon. These two separate dominions reached political independence from British rule in 1947 and 48 respectively. And in each of the newly independent nations that ensued, namely India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, which was formerly East Pakistan until 1971, and Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, modern architecture became an active agent in what are for us 3 key aspects, namely, first, in asserting participation in international politics of progress, secondly, in forging regional identities, and third, in breaking with the colonial past. These 4 countries all had a centuries-long history of British, also other colonization, and they are therefore often represented as a shared cultural space whose identity is defined as much by an interconnected history in the pre-colonial and colonial periods as by the ways in which, after independence, they reimagined themselves as progressive, egalitarian, and predominantly secular nation states. This holds true notwithstanding the trauma in India and Pakistan of partition, which left hundreds of thousands dead and led to one of the largest refugee crises in human history, which of course we are also addressing, albeit obliquely, in our exhibition. Much of the original material that we are presenting in our exhibition and accompanying catalog in terms of sketches, architectural drawings, and plans will be presented for the first time to a wider audience. And while several of the most prominent South Asian architects have in recent years received monographic exhibitions, I'm thinking, for example, of Balkrishna Doshi's retrospective, which was organized by the Vitra Design Museum a few years ago, the Project of Independence is really the first attempt to consider the impressive and significant output of these architects within the ideological frameworks of its creation and the political context of the region as a whole. The transnational approach is in fact key to our methodology and thesis. Much more than just an investigation of a specific regional narrative, the Project of Independence seeks to enhance our understanding of the shared histories among newly independent countries, as well as the conditions that are shaping present realities in the global South. This upcoming exhibition reflects the commitment of the Department of Architecture and Design at MoMA to expanding our outlook beyond the European and North American canon that until recently informed the majority of our exhibitions. In 2015, MoMA presented Latin America in Construction, Architecture 1955 to 1980, a landmark survey of modern architecture in Latin America. Subsequently, attention shifted more explicitly to questions of decolonization and self-assertion, with the already mentioned Toward a Concrete Utopia, Architecture in Yugoslavia 48 to 80, a focus that will be further explored and enhanced in our upcoming exhibition. Even before this undertaking, MoMA dedicated substantial exhibitions to South Asia, including the celebrated Textiles and Ornamental Arts in India, 1955, or the 1963 exhibition Le Corbusier Building in Europe and India, which explored the Swiss-French architect's groundbreaking design for the new Punjab capital of Chandigarh, India, in the context of his global practice. With its thematic focus, the Project of Independence takes a different approach, one that celebrates and evaluates the work of the first generation of post-independent South Asian architects and engineers. In our view, the unequivocal embrace of progressive values and of newly founded institutions by this generation of architects and intellectuals has lost none of its relevance for our contemporary moment, when many achievements of the mid-century social contract are under attack, and the buildings that embodied these societal aspirations along with them. In her recent study, World Making After Empire, Adom Gedaju presents an argument for understanding the political project of decolonization in the mid-20th century through a reconceptualization of, quote, anti-colonial nationalism as world-making. Nationalism as world-making. Translated to the context of South Asian architecture, from Gedaju's primary focus on the Black Atlantic world and the sphere of international politics, this position implies a practice of design and construction that speaks not only to the immediate needs of the newly founded nation states and their respective desires for self-representation, but also to the aspiration to be part of a larger international conversation about modernity. The construction of a newly built environment was an important dimension of post-colonial cultural production that gained aesthetic agency and symbolic meaning by aligning with political goals. Hence, in post-independence South Asia, modern architecture should be considered a constitutive part of the process of post-colonial political and cultural decolonization within a broader project of world-making. Nationalism and cosmopolitanism, from this perspective, are not to be understood as mutually exclusive, but rather as interdependent forces that defined the politics of decolonization in the global South. While recent research across disciplines has powerfully asserted the degree to which modernity and colonialism were and are intertwined and unthinkable without each other, we believe it is worth emphasizing that modernity And modernism, as its cultural articulation, was also embraced as a powerful tool in the process of decolonization, not least through the ways in which it embodied and expressed the collective social aspirations of the region's newly independent nations. It was only consequential in this context that many architects turned away from British models of architectural pedagogy and versions of the modern, such as the Art Deco, which had been popularized in urban centers such as Bombay under British rule, or the incorporation of aspects of traditional monumental architecture in the colonial modern Indo-Saracenic style, and instead looked to align themselves with a continental conception of modernism, often filtered through the so-called international style in the United States, but adapted to the very different economic, cultural, climatic, and technological situation in South Asia. The negotiation of universalist modernism with the labor conditions and material culture on the ground is key for understanding the unique significance of this body of work. And I'm showing you here two examples of photographs from the Chandigarh construction site, which I think very beautifully sort of represents sort of this tension between the aspiration of a modernist architectural language on the one hand and the reality of manual labor on the other. Modern architecture in this light can be understood as serving as an instrument of cultural emancipation, not only from the weight of political and cultural colonization, but also from a rigid conception of modernism as uniquely developed by the West and considered from a Western perspective. In this spirit, we do not dwell at length on Le Corbusier and Louis Kahn, the two seminal Western figures who have been celebrated many times previously for their bold contributions to architectural modernism in South Asia. Nor do we offer an expansive discussion of the many other foreign architects who were realizing projects in the regions after independence, among them figures such as Richard Neutra, Edward Ralston, or Joe Ponti. Instead, the focus is on significant projects of the first generation of post-independence architects who either were born in the region or settled there permanently. Many members of this generation trained in the West, and upon their return to the region adapted and interrogated their education in addressing the social, economic, cultural, and material conditions on site, furthering the notion of a synthetic approach that speaks to both global and local frames of reference. While some of these efforts have in the past been judged harshly as having aligned too closely with Western precedents, these architects' highly reflective design processes were shaped by competing notions of identity. One anchored in a sense of transnational modernity, and the other rooted in the specificity of place. It is in this tension between the universal and the specific that the historical and aesthetic significance of the impressive body of work of the first generation of post-independence architects in South Asia is situated. And with that, I would like to give you a very brief overview of the organizational structure of the exhibition. And as you might already suspect, rather than proposing a chronology, which would actually be relatively different in the four countries under consideration, we have organized the exhibition and also the catalog, by the way, into a number of thematic chapters. In the exhibition, we are specifically talking about 6 such thematic focuses, each of which deals with a specific aspect of the built environment. So the first chapter is dealing with new cities. And obviously we are obliquely referencing Chandigarh, again, through the lens of labor. So we're not actually demonstrating or showcasing so much the buildings by Le Corbusier. Many of the local architects who were involved in this project, but we're sort of investigating how this aspiration of international modernism was met on the ground with the specific material and craft and labor traditions. One of the architects that we're featuring prominently is Aditya Prakash, who was involved in the construction of Chandigarh, and who later, in his later career, developed this sort of utopian vision of a linear city, which further sought to ground sort of this abstract notion of modernism in the specific context of northern India. Then the next chapter will be dealing with housing, obviously a very important aspect given the rapid urbanization of many of these countries, but also, of course, of the enormous refugee crisis that ensued from the partition, which left many, many hundreds of thousands of people homeless, which meant that several of these countries, in particular Pakistan and India, had to engage in massive housing projects. I'm showing you here the Anguri Bagh house by the Pakistani woman architect Yasmin Lari, the first licensed woman architect of her home country, or then Charles Korea's Belapur housing, which was a ambitious expansion project for the city of Bombay, which also allowed for people to basically gave people agency and participation in building on a given module and adapting it their own needs and size of family and so on and so forth. Our next chapter is industry and infrastructure. Of course, the building up of an industry in these formerly rather rural society was an important aspect of the politics of emancipation. And we have obviously a whole architectural apparatus that gave shape and form to this aspiration. Here on the left, the headquarters of the Steel Corporation offices near Colombo by Jeffrey Bawa, a project actually funded by the Soviet Union, which is an interesting sideline on the sort of geopolitical situation of the subcontinent at the time. And on the right, a really fascinating hotel project by another prominent Sri Lankan architect, Valentine Gunasekara, the Tangal Bay Hotel, which also speaks, of course, to the incredible importance of the growing tourism sector as really the key industry of Sri Lanka. We have then a more sort of formal space about chapter about political spaces, where we have front and center the Hall of Nations by Roger Wall and the engineer Mahendra Raj, a building that was constructed on the 25th anniversary of the independence of India from colonial rule, as part of an international exposition, an absolutely fabulous and fantastic space that was unfortunately torn down in 2017 illegally. Also sort of a marker of the contestedness of this body of modern architecture that so much embodied the modernist progressive project at mid-century. And then I think particularly interesting for our conversation is, of course, the construction of an entire apparatus of educational institutions, with the idea, of course, to democratize access to higher education on the one hand, but also to provide a self-sufficient system of education for the population, the people in these 4 countries, so they would no longer depend on having to send their students abroad for higher education. So we have a very large section dealing with what we call this landscape of education. And we have a whole bunch of typologies that relate to this here. For example, the College of Arts and Crafts, now the Institute of Fine Arts in Dhaka, Bangladesh, by the father of architectural modernism in Bangladesh, Muzarul Islam, a very beautiful project with a very clear, as you can see, plan. Then here a Montessori school for younger children by Jeffrey Bawa, which sort of very, for the first time while using concrete, very specifically relates to vernacular architectural traditions. on the island. But then, of course, also the side of architectural education, and perhaps the most prominent example of that would be the SEPT, which was founded by Balkrishna Doshi, whom I've mentioned. The SEPT would become one of the definitely one of the regions, if not one of the world's most important architecture school, and continues to thrive to the present day in Ahmedabad. Or then also the many sort of national institutes of technology and business administration that were built here, with an example by the equally significant architect Achyut Kanvinda, the Indian Institute of Technology, which was part of a larger network of several of these IITs that were strategically sort of organized across the entire territory of India. And we have very similar undertakings happening also in the other countries under review. Another absolutely stunning project for such a project of higher education would be Chittagong University by Muzarul Islam. Again, just one of the several university projects that Islam was involved with pre and post independence of Bangladesh from from Pakistan. And I think the plan here on the right, the side plan, is particularly telling how the architect ingeniously superimposes sort of this abstract architectural language of a geometric modernism over the intricate topography of this hilly ground on which it was erected, really sort of integrating into sort of the natural landscape and setting of the building. And then a final section of the exhibition is dealing with institution building on a broader scale, so not necessarily just educational institutions, but the whole arsenal of other additional institutions that really spoke again to the broad societal aspirations and the project of self-determination in the attempt to come away from colonial dependency. Here, for example, the Lalbhai Institute of Indology in Ahmedabad, another famous project by Balkrishna Doshi, or then also the many mosques that Anwar Said built in the newly founded capital city of Islamabad in Pakistan, sort of a really sort of very abstract geometric interpretation of architecture and its application here to a sacred typology, namely the mosque. And then, of course, just to conclude very briefly, as always, our large research projects end up not only being exhibitions and also very often acquisitions for the permanent collection of the museum, but they're also accompanied by catalogs that really, aim to be state-of-the-art research. You can see here in the table of content that we believe in a sort of in a polyphony of voices. So rather than giving just authority to the curators to speak about the subject matter, we've invited a whole number of scholars, many of whom originate originally from the subcontinent, and we hope through that to create a conversation about this topic with a plurality of points of view and opinions. Yes, and that's all I had. Thank you so much for your interest.
Thank you, Martino. That's a fascinating project, and really looking forward to the exhibition at MoMA next year. I know that you might have to leave earlier, so we are now entering into the time of Q&A and discussion. Maybe I'll just start with you, Martino. When you talk about the decolonization, that really sometimes refers to a process where utopia is being projected. And I'm just wondering, in your exhibition, apart from the kind of building types that you curated in order to move the country, the independent country, into a new world, whether there would be in the form of the building, in the actual architectonic, this embodiment of utopia in the decolonization architectural world?
Yeah, thank you for this question, which is one I'm very interested in. And I would say yes and no. I think there are some of these sort of very structurally expressive buildings, and I've shown you some examples. And, you know, it is very interesting that in many of these, the structural engineer played a very significant part in the design process. We have this incredible figure of Mahendra Raj, a Delhi-based structural engineer who's still very much active. He's in his 90s now, and he worked with all the major architects in India, at least. And so I think there is in that collaboration of him with many of the architects I showed, I think sort of a distinctive architectural language that speaks to this utopian projection. And it's really, you know, expressed through this bold structural expressionism that, you know, has also been featured, for example, in the SOS Brutalism survey at the German Architecture Museum a few years ago. However, our exhibition takes a broader approach. We also feature, you know, contributions by architects who do basically the opposite. I'm thinking, for example, of Laurie Baker, an architect who was active in Kerala mainly, and who really sort of worked very much with, you know, local labor and, you know, brick architecture, sort of very participatory engagement with the local population. Or then also I'm thinking of Minette de Silva, the first, you know, woman architect from Sri Lanka, who very early on projected an idea of a climate sensitive modernity that, you know, was much more regionally grounded than, say, these sort of bold utopian propositions that many of the architects I was talking about earlier bring. So it's a yes and no, I would say.
Thank you so much. Yes, it's always a yes and no. Any questions that any issues that you think we should discuss, Moritz? Yeah, raise your hand and we can join in the discussion.
Yes, hello. Thank you very much, Martino. I want to ask, very simple questions. Will the exhibition be shown in India, in Sri Lanka, in Pakistan, or in any of the countries you refer to?
No, there are no plans to travel the exhibition. There's a number of reasons for that. First of all, there is not necessarily in any of these countries a logical institution that would house architectural exhibitions. Architectural exhibitions have taken place in the past. For example, Uta Meto actually just pointed out the several exhibitions that Rahul Mehrotra has organized in Bombay. But, you know, in reality, Roma projects are architecture projects of this scale are usually of a complexity and expense that it is virtually impossible for partner institution to host them. They're just, you know, too expensive, which is a shame because obviously we believe very much, you know, that, you know, our primary audience would be the people, you know, from the region. But, you know, that said, we have especially in New York, of course, very strong diasporas of, you know, people from the subcontinent. And so we're hoping at least that we will be able to attract their interest and, you know, bring them into a transnational conversation. So here's another sort of aspect where sort of the idealism of the curators hits the ground of reality. So that's very unfortunate.
Yes, I think so too, because if we are talking as, for example, Woodley No pointed out for Cambodia, some of these countries have a very, let's say, fragmented or interrupted or let's say history. And as you say, there's a lack of, and that's what also pointed out, there's a lack of structure that is able to do this work. But even more, I think it is important to bring it there. So I think a lot of collections by architects go to the MoMA or to the M+ or to any other institutions outside of the countries where the architects come from. So, and then they are exhibited in New York or in Hong Kong or or maybe in Singapore. And I think this is I think this is a problem. You said why it is a problem, but what could be a way to deal with it?
Well, I mean, yes, I mean, you know, you could see this as a sort of neo-colonial imposition. And, you know, I think I think the situation for me is a little more nuanced. I think, you know, for me as an architectural historian, it is first of all important to raise awareness for the incredible significance of this body of work from this part of the world. And of course, also, you know, from Southeast Asia and from many other places that have just not received any kind of attention and that are, you know, under heavy distress. And so I do think, you know, an exhibition at a place like MoMA that just has a very sort of large international platform visibility is a first step to raise awareness and give, you know, back the dignity to these buildings, but also to the people that inhabit them and the people that built them. And then, you know, hopefully through that we can help raise awareness also on the ground that it might help to, you know, edify institutions there that would, you know, be able to maintain that heritage. You know, of course, you know, that said, given the current political situation, particularly in India, I'm not terribly optimistic that's going to happen right away, but at least, you know, we have to try. And then I think the other question that you sort of raised implicitly was the question of collection, right? I mean, exhibiting something is not the same as collecting it. So, you know, we wouldn't ever collect everything, nor could we collect everything that we show. And as a matter of fact, many of the things that we're going to show are actually already in public collections, you know, university archives. But then, of course, there are offices, you know, many, for example, Convinde is a case where the whole legacy of this incredibly prolific architect is still kept in the office. And that's fine as long as the office is there, but, you know, that's not going to be forever. And in this case, you know, I feel it's legitimate in the absence of a, you know, national institution that collects archives in India to define a body of work, not to take the whole archive, but to define a body of work that becomes part of the museum and that can interact in tandem with the archive wherever it goes to secure ongoing visibility of this archive. But, you know, that is always, it's walking a fine line. I totally agree.
Thank you, Martino. That's wonderful. I think Pauline has raised her hand, and then maybe we go back to Uta. Pauline.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Martino. As a fellow architecture historian, if you cannot travel your exhibition to South Asia, would you consider traveling it to Europe at least? Because there's an audience there. We're not all able to travel to New York, at least not currently. And I think in Europe, there would equally be an audience interested. The second comment would be, I understand the level and the quality of your exhibition at MoMA, which is super high and potentially not realistic to expect other countries or institutions to follow that standard. But then would it be possible to adjust and tweak your exhibition, make it smaller, and maybe, you know, be open to organizations that would then sort of adopt the project and bring it to South Asia? It doesn't necessarily have to be the complexity maybe of your exhibition. Because I do support Moritz's point of view. That's always, with the colonies, there's always this issue of distance and how do you reach the direct audience on the ground?
Yeah, thanks, Pauline. I think, I mean, in the interest of time, shall we just make it very succinct? Question and answer. Martino, you want to answer that?
I will try. No, look, I'm as a curator, of course, would be thrilled if this exhibition traveled around the world for years. And, you know, I'm just telling you, there are many, you know, institutional and, you know, larger obstacles out there that have to be surmounted, even bringing an exhibition to, you know, Europe. You know, the Latin American construction show was supposed to be traveling to Europe. It ended up not going because nobody could pay the fee. You know, the insurance value, the whole management of bringing several hundred objects across it's just all very costly, especially if you treat each of these objects as a work of art, which you do as a museum. Of course, you could deal with this by using reproductions or, you know, just photographs. I mean, there are many ways to do this, but, you know, it's always a translation. And so that's work. And, you know, there's only so much we can do. But, you know, we can hopefully start a conversation and inspire, you know, other people in the ground to do further work.
Great. Thank you, Uta.
I think it really introduces a much bigger problem, and that, as you say, Martino, instead of collecting, I think I'm come more from the world of art, and I think there, in the meantime, is understood. I mean, we are not only collecting works of art, but also archives, support material. But when we worked, for example, with Jonas Friedman, and I interviewed him, that was like because we showed him in Documenta in 2002. He just threw away half of his archive because he had to give up the studio and he couldn't move everything to the apartment. And it broke my heart, and like to see the works of this architect thrown in the garbage. And if I see Echo talking about Mangun, and so like, again, I understood that Farid, I mean, somebody just mentioned that Farid Raccoon, they wanted to print a book on him for Documenta 15, and it's so difficult. And I think it's so interesting to me if I see the slides and everything, that already is so amazing. So catalogs are tremendously important, and if there is some material online or walkthrough is already so helpful, because so much material gets lost. And when we did the show in Willy Lim, I'm not an expert, I'm not an architect, but nobody did anything. So I just felt it's better we do it than nobody. And we currently try to reprint iPress from Thomas McNulty and Mary Otis Stevens from MIT, because again, nobody does it. And of course, I'm get asked here, why am I doing this in Singapore? And I again say, like, well, because nobody does it. So, you know, you feel always the urgency. So I wonder what bigger institutions like MoMA could do to, you know, as Pauline said, they give a lot of legitimacy, they give credibility. I mean, so to maybe support other institutions to at least try to preserve archives, etc., because even that goes lost.
Thanks, Uta. I don't know whether Martina want to take this, because I don't want to focus everything on you. I think that there's so many other things that we can talk about. But in actual fact, Uta, in Singapore, we are starting an architecture archive. And so we are collecting works of early architects since independence. We now do about 15 of them now. And so that will be an interesting aspect. Maybe I'll just go to Maria.
We actually had a conversation recently with your colleagues from the National Gallery in Singapore. So we are obviously very interested in having regional institutions collect the work from there, because those are, you know, for us as an institution in New York, it's of course also much easier to have a partner in Singapore and in Phnom Penh and in Delhi, an institutional partner who we can exchange material with, and having to always go directly to the source.
Yeah.
Hello.
Great. Okay, Maria.
Yeah. Yes, I'm Maria Jose. I'm an architect. Actually, I live in Macau. Actually, also I'm the president of SBH. Somebody spoke, Pauline, I think, about SBH in ICOMOS. So welcome to SBH. And I'm in the middle of shared heritage. In my background, you can see a picture of Macau. As somebody, Pauline, also you'd met, some of you mentioned, there's a lack of information about modernism. And in Macau, we have examples of modernism, as we have also in Hong Kong, and we have in cities nearby in Southeast Asia. And so I think all these kind of meetings are important, and the kind of exhibition Martino is talking about is very important, and in somehow if can be also shared with by academia or by even by ICOMOS, spread the message and then have a better knowledge about what is done, about what is being done locally, about decolonization, about these kind of situations, I think will be very fruitful for all the students studying here that will be the architects of tomorrow. They need to learn with the past. They need to better understand the past to go to the future. And we have many lessons. So as much as we can share is better for everybody. This is my big message. I feel this really. And the work done by Lino with the White House, I think is a good example of what can be done. And actually, I'm working with some groups in Wuhan, China, and we are practicing with the young people. The Youth Forum last week, and will be in the future, is really a strong message for the future. So it's important to share. And this modernism, this decolonization period, all of this is an important part of our history that we cannot forget, we cannot hide. We need to learn with it. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. That's a very good point. Any other questions or comments that we want to ask each other or from the audience, please? Okay, Lino, you have a question.
We still have a couple of minutes, and then we so
yeah, Lino, please.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry to go back to you, Martino, and but yeah, it's really important work, and I think it's remarkable the scope of that research and project that you're working on. And I just want to raise a couple of points in response to what was mentioned before. I think I echo with Uta, while we acknowledge the lack of the infrastructure to maintain or sustain certain kind of knowledge or archive in the localities, I think we should not just give up easily in terms of, okay, the very first step is the only way, that is, producing that and archiving that and presenting that in the West, because of the resources and this supporting infrastructure. So I was very uncomfortable when you mentioned that was the first step. So because it seems that we accept this is the only way that we can start. So I think maybe we can think about other possibility of engaging the local infrastructure, either in whatever form it is. I think it's important to rethink about what it exists there, and maybe it requires us to rethink about what is that infrastructure. It doesn't have to replicate the exact infrastructure in the West, but it needs to be adapted in that local context. And I think throughout these presentations and talks, it's fascinating, and everyone agree and accept that the architecture in the South. We have talked about the adaptation and climate and environment sensitivity, and that the architecture address and respond to that local context. So why not we think as well about how can we build institution, archival institution and whatnot that is adapted to the local context, like the building, like architecture. So for example, like here in the National Archive in Phnom Penh, it's very humble. It's everything is stored in like these shells and each cardboard boxes. Some materials are digitized and whatnot, but it tried to adapt with what they have. And so therefore the knowledge is disseminated and and continue to sustain in this local context rather than migrating and moving and to be concentrated in the West. And in particularly so because of this, the title of this conference is Decolonizing Education. I think it is important for us to be mindful and to be really conscious about this. Thank you.
Now, sometimes it's not only in the West, as Maurice mentioned. Some of our objects, like in Singapore, William Lim's objects are now in M+, and so that's why we are starting this archive in order to stop the outflow of the objects and materials from our early architects. Yeah.
I do want to say something to that. You know, I do agree in principle. I really do. And I do hope that, you know, we can all help support building such an infrastructure of discourse. I think that's a term somebody used earlier, which I liked. You know, but also keep in mind, you know, in the end, you know, I think it's also important that we as, you know, curators in these Western institutions that have been the powerhouse of discourse for so many decades are thinking about how we come away from just telling the narratives of Western art and architectural history. And, you know, the way to do this is to bring these voices that have been systematically overlooked and excluded into the conversation. And we can only do that when we do that, you know, at the very sort of what has been conceived as the center. So we want to destabilize this idea of center periphery and not to reinforce it. But of course, as always, this is a double bind. And, you know, I'm very aware of this, but I hope you also understand, you know, that we, you know, for us as an institution, and for me as a curator in this institution, it's very important to be able to do this work. Because I think we have a lot of work to do to, you know, rethink the very way modern architectural history has been conceptualized and taught.
Thank you, Martino. Edward?
Yes, I think, you know, this is really also important aspect that we do have to have a discourse here in the West about these topics, because in some aspects it's impossible to do the discourse on site, especially if it comes, for instance, to India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka. Then there is a political tension between those countries. And even if their history is comparable and there could be a discourse between these countries, it's politically very difficult. So I think, you know, such a discourse has to be relocated to a neutral space, so to say. And then maybe it can also influence the discourse again. You know, but it would not be possible to have a discourse in Pakistan about Indian development or the other way around. So I think there is also a role which we play in the West in bringing together aspects which otherwise would not come together.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. I mean, that's a very, very valid point. Yeah. Any other hand raise? Any issues? Any comments? Or else I will just close the symposium and return the table to the curators. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Peng, for your excellent moderation of the discussion. It was a great honor to have you again with us. And also thank you to all the speakers of today's event and also the 3 previous symposia. So it was great that you all shared your knowledge with us and stimulated the debate on postcolonial modernism. And I think we are, with the whole debate, we are just at the starting point right now. For us as a curatorial team of contested modernities, this project somehow ends at this moment exactly. But we are sure everyone is going to continue with the themes of it, and we are also looking forward to kind of bring the project into a next phase, but that means still a lot of work. So for now, we would like to take the chance to thank all participants of the projects Contested Modernities and Encounters with Southeast Asian Modernism. And so I would like to ask my colleagues Moritz, Sally, and Eduard to join me here on the virtual stage for last goodbye, and thanks to the team. Yeah, I want still give a thank to Erwin Wilms for the smooth technical transmission today and in the last events, and also many thanks to Sarah Reiche and Amelie Schulz for the extremely professional coordination of the whole series. Thank you. So I give the word to Eduard, who wants to thank the curatorial team in large.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for the opportunity. I take the opportunity today to thank all the co-curators of the project in Southeast Asia. Without them, it would have been impossible to bring together such a wide range of topics and insights in our project Contested Modernities. For the part Faulting Concrete from Phnom Penh, our thanks go to Pen Serepanya and Wood Lino. For the part Occupying Modernism from Jakarta, our thanks go to Avianti Armand and Setiadi Soprandi, and with Vivandi Nugoru. For the part Visualization of the National History from, by, and for whom from Indonesia, our thanks go to Grace Sambo, Hyphen, and Rangrupa with Good School. And for the part Synthesis of Myanmar Modernity from Yangon, our thanks go to Wind and Win Tan Win Schwin. For the part Housing Modernities from Singapore, our thanks go to Ho Pui Peng with Nikhil, Yoshi, and Johannes Widodo. Thank you all, and hopefully we soon will have further possibility to exchange knowledge and share insights. I pass on to Sally.
Yes, yes, I thank my whole team. Eduard already, Christian already mentioned Sarah Reich and Amelie Schulz, but I have to do it again because they also helped a lot with the exhibition and all the things we did before in this large project. And I thank Alexander Römer and Peter Södervik and the team of Construct Lab for our fantastic exhibition design. Some of you could see it, the other ones only on the screen. House of Statistics, Frauke Gerstenberg and Nina Peters. Without them, we wouldn't have had such a great venue for exhibition and a lot of talks together. I know that they were invited to the NUS talk within the next days, so we continue the encounters. It's not the end. I think team of Arch Plus and Stadtkultur International and our supporters and funders, because we had the Hauptstadtkultur from Berlin and the Federal Ministry of the Interior, Building and Community, who gave us money for this Contested Modernity project, the Senate Department for Urban Development and Housing in Berlin, the governing mayor of Berlin, Senate Chancellery, the Goethe Institutes in Jakarta, Myanmar, and Singapore, the Embassy of the Federal Republic of Germany in Singapore, the Embassy of the Republic of Indonesia in Berlin, the National University of Singapore, the Department of Architecture, and the Embassy of the Republic of Singapore in Berlin. So you see, we had a lot of supporters and partners, and we will continue the talks and the discourse within the next years, I think. Thank you. Moritz, you are your turn. Last but not least.
Yes. Okay. Okay. So I think there's very little left to say. I just want to mention that everything we did during the last, well, not everything, but most of it is documented on our website, the seam.encounters website. There you can also watch the other videos of the symposiums. We did since the last 3-4 months. Then we had, as part of the project, we made the magazine, the Arch Plus magazine, which just was published in an English version by Birkhäuser. So If you want to read about the project, the contributions will somehow extend the debate, not just replicate what was shown in the exhibition. So watch out for this. Yes, what came to my mind when listening to all these lectures is that at least one thing was good about the pandemic. So what we originally planned was bringing all the curators to Berlin for the opening of the exhibition and having a large symposium meeting live physically. This was impossible. But the idea of moving this debate, the idea of moving the debate to the online world, I think was, for us, it was really great because we reached a lot more diverse audience. I mean, it would not have been possible to invite Martino or Eko Pravoto or all of you to Berlin. That would not have been possible. And so this was, in fact, good for us. It's hard to say, but it was like this. And I think in another way, this was good because especially against the background of the climate change we are facing, we have to think about new ways of doing a discourse, and this cannot be done by flying 10,000 kilometers for a lecture to whatever part of the world. So we have to think about new ways, and this is what really is another thing that is an important experience for me. It is possible without physically attending something. So, and I think we have to work on this. And this is another point. We have to think about how can we change, how can we share knowledge, how can we share, for example, archives. Just in case of the MoMA exhibition, how will it be documented online? So it doesn't have to go physically to another place. It can go online, and we can share things like this in another way. And this is what we have to look for, I think. Yes, why do I mention this? I also mention this because we, of course, want to continue with the project. And even if the contested modernities are over now, the project will not end. So there's a couple of things in the pipeline. It's a bit too early to go into details, so I want to keep it short. And we have to think about this in the next weeks, and we have to do some fundraising. And well, let's see what in the end will work for us all. So, and this is another thing that I want to add. If any of you out there has any idea that you think might fit into the context of the project, please feel free to get in touch with us. We would really appreciate to get some input, not only on the work we already did, but maybe to join forces for in the future. So, okay, yes. With this in mind, I would like now to say thank you to all of you out there. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for staying with us until now. And yes, hope to see you again one day. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you. Bye.